A Very Real Werewolf Encounter by Grimsley. Hello, Swamp Dweller. I'm a long-time listener, but this is my first time ever actually telling a story here. I used to live in Anchorage, Alaska, and believe me when I tell you, you couldn't ask for a more beautiful landscape. Sometimes just walking out the door felt like stepping into a painting. Despite this inherent beauty, there are many dangerous things in Alaska that many people may not realize, such as bull moose charging your car, driving between towns because of an emergency due to engine trouble, and how your lungs can freeze if it gets cold enough. Most of these dangers can be prepared for and mitigated mainly due to an exceptional state police force and rescue services. But it would be an error not to mention that people in Alaska, well, they're just built differently. Folks are tough here, and people are a lot more open to lending a helping hand to a stranger in Alaska. After all, you never know when your life might be on the line. I was about 8 years old. My stepdad was a trucker and often spent weeks away from home, whereas my mom worked the night shift as a respiratory therapist at the hospital. I was a rather lonely kid. Alaska doesn't have very many people, and my class was incredibly small. I had just moved to town the year before and had difficulty wedging myself into the existing friends group. I'll leave it at that. When my parents did both have long stretches of days off, they tried to make up for the lost time and would take me camping. As a result, I've seen many of Alaska's state and national parks, and holy crow, you have to check these things out. Just don't stay the night. On one of these camping trips, we went to the Denali National Park. The park is massive, spanning 7,408 miles of deep wilderness with an additional 2,085 square miles of nature preserve directly bordering it to the west. The park's northern half is blanketed in thick pine forest spotted with lakes and crisscrossed with streams. The imposing Mount Denali dominates the southern half, a 20,310-foot snow-capped and glacier-bearing behemoth of a mountain. There are all sorts of wildlife from bears to wolves, elk, moose, deer, raccoons, foxes. If you've seen it in a fairy tale picture book, it's probably there. Man, is it gorgeous, except for the mosquitoes. There's a common joke in Alaska that mosquitoes are the state bird. They aren't quite that big, admittedly, but they are more than the size of a quarter. But think about it. These mosquitoes have to punch through thick hide of bears and moose. They are precisely gentle feeders. Anyway, we were set to camp there for 2 nights. My stepdad was hell-bent on fishing to his heart's content, while my mom mostly just wanted to lounge about and watch animals. I was more interested in exploring, but it was Alaska, and being well-warned and thoroughly scared of the potential predators in such a place, I mostly stayed put and fished with my dad. Things went well that first day. The fish seemed to be biting the bait every 10 minutes or so. I must have had a good spot, or maybe just really good luck. I've never caught so many fish in my life. We only kept 2 to fry up that night for dinner. My mom was in a good mood too, since she had seen a herd of elk come down through the stream to drink. We cooked our fish as the sun got low, and I listened to them tell stories about their childhoods under what would be the most spectacular night sky I had ever seen. I soon got tired and decided to go to my tent. I quickly fell asleep, and that's when things began to get weird. I woke up suddenly, opened my eyes, and saw nothing but pitch blackness in front of me. I was startled pretty bad, but then I remembered where I was and laughed at myself a little bit. But then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching sound coming from just outside of my tent near the opening flap. I remembered freezing and just listening. It must be a tree. It has to be a tree. But we didn't camp near any of the trees because my mom thought pine cones might poke a hole in the tent. Now, there are maybe other explanations that could have been figured out by some sort of a more rational person, but for 8-year-old me, if it wasn't a tree making that sound, I didn't know what it was. It could be anything, like a boogeyman. My freezing instinct went into full gear now. My chest was so tight, I could barely breathe. It felt like every muscle had been flexed and locked into place. I listened for what must have been a few minutes, not moving, not making a sound. Then, everything just stopped. The next thing I heard was a single footstep, as if somebody had shifted their stance directly outside my tent. Now at first, this was kind of reassuring. I thought, oh, well, it must be my mom or dad checking in on me. I still felt shaky and excited, but I could finally move with that rationalization. I crawled towards the opening flap. For some reason, it was still quiet, and I was trying to be as silent as possible. Some deeper, intuitive part of me knew something was wrong, even if my rational brain was trying to shrug it off. I reached up to grab the zipper. The small metal eyelet touched my fingers no more than once before I heard something more. Whatever was outside my tent, a deep, guttural breath. I froze again, but this time in a more awkward position, with one arm raised, supporting myself like a tripod. I noticed my discomfort pretty much immediately, but could not shift slightly to unjam my wrist from its overstretched position below me. The breathing turned into a snuffle, then a snort. It was then sniffing and coming closer to the horrifyingly thin and flimsy, half-centered, thick fabric separating me from whatever creature was out there, whether it be a bear, a wolf, whatever. I began to shake all over. Then I heard a laugh. It was deep, but for that shining moment, I knew it must be my dad trying to scare me. I became relieved, hysterical, and furious all at once. I ripped the zipper down, pulled up the flap, shrieked and peed myself and started screaming some more. The thing I saw standing outside the black and shadowed hole of my meager shelter was without a doubt not my dad. It was hunching over my tent's entrance, standing on two legs. It was covered in fur. I couldn't tell the color in the dark, but its eyes were definitely enormous. If I had to guess and try to put a color to it, it definitely had some sort of amber tint to it. The wolf-like head pulled its thick lips back with enormous fangs showing. Its pointed ears flattened against the back of its skull. It began to growl, sending ripples of sharp panic through the trembling body of myself. Me screaming intensified and got louder. One long hairy arm began to reach out through the opening of my tent, a grasping, clawed hand reaching ever closer. A loud, sudden gunshot rang out, followed immediately by a cracking sound a little ways down the creature's right. The beast whirled to its left so fast I swear it was a blur. Now I could see its back. A long, fluffy tail spouted out from the end of the beast's spine. I saw its foot enter my field of view and saw that it was anatomically very similar to a wolf's. Then I heard my dad start yelling, and another gunshot rang out. The creature again moved so fast I could barely see it. Within a split second, it was gone into the branches of the woods. My dad ran over to my tent, looked inside for about 1 second to see if I was alive, and then turned back to the forest. His .50 cal revolver still drawn. I had never before or seen him look so terrified. I started to cry and ask over and over what the heck that thing was. But I don't think we'll ever know. My parents tell me it was a bear, but I think it was something much different. A Horrific Solo Camping Experience by Philip B. Hello, I'm an avid solo traveler, and this is a story of one of my experiences traveling across the United States in 2022. Several people have heard about my story from the colorful Colorado area. I had run into a bear and it was definitely a fight for survival. But only a few have heard about the 2 nights on the trail that compelled me to move to a new campsite. This is the story of one of those nights. This event took place in Arkansas, just across the mighty Mississippi River from the Magnolia State. I had heard about a possible campsite at the end of a dirt road in a cypress swamp. I made my way deeper and deeper into the swamp, half expecting to see Hattie's Shack or something like that at any moment. I finally arrived as it was getting dark. I quickly set up, boiling some water for my nightly mountain house dinner, probably some sort of beef stroganoff. I had an overabundance of that particular meal, thanks to my buddies Brandon and Raleigh. Anyway, I finished my meal and started setting things up and getting ready for bed, when across the swamp I heard something of a knock or maybe even like a pinging sound. If you've ever been in a swamp at night, you know it's alive with sounds of frogs, crickets, otters splashing, and lots of animal noises. So a knock kind of stood out. Not necessarily in a scary way quite yet, but it just caught my attention. A moment later, I heard a second knock, but this time from a completely different location. This happened again a couple of minutes later. One knock to my left, followed by a second knock to my right. They were coming from the murky waters of the swamp beside me. This fell into a pattern. I got my flashlight out and edged a bit closer to the water, being sure to be careful, of course. As usual, if you have a flashlight across a swamp at night, you'll be greeted with tiny lights, also known as the reflective properties of the inhabitants' eyes. Things are getting kind of creepy at this point, but not enough to make me want to leave camp. I go back to the truck and I hear the knock again. This time I also listen to what can only be described as mumbling. Yes, it was answered by a knock and a mumble from another location. As this continued, the location of the sound seemed to be moving around. During all this, my brain decided it was a great time to think about the Issaquena Dam and the stories that I heard that go all the way back to high school. As a kid, one of my favorite books was The Swamp Thing. Suddenly, I'm cursing myself for ever even glancing at the pulp trash. Isolation, darkness, unknown sounds, these things can really wreak havoc on the human mind. The sounds continued, never picking up pace or anything, but an occasional flickering light joined them. It could have been wayward fireflies, the spark of a lighter, firefox, something like that, some sort of swamp gas. The sounds were authentic, though. I was having close encounters with a couple of Bigfoots back in the past, and I think maybe they were curious about me, so I tried to think about the noises that I heard those nights, and they were pretty similar. My more logical self is sure that there was some unsavory swamp people out there doing swamp people business, and they just wanted me gone. Ultimately, I decided it was best if I just rolled out of that spot and go to a different one I had seen up the road. Luckily, my truck setup has a very easy moving camp. It's pretty straightforward and is really simple to set up and break down. As fast as I could, I loaded up, hopped in the cab, and away we went. Once I got away from the swamp, I calmed down, found my alternate campsite, and settled in for a restless night of no sleep. Nothing came from the depths of the swamp to get me, but there was definitely an off vibe. I'm sure that something was out there. I'm just unsure of what it was in those murky waters. But I don't get scared easily. If you camp, especially solo camp like I do, you have to have some thick skin and some tough bones. But this was a night to where the vibe, the energy, it was so palpable you could have cut it with a knife. And I just did not want to chance that. But there you have it. I've been asked many times if I am scared about camping alone, and by far the answer is no. I'm certainly not afraid of animals. I respect and give them distance they require, but I use common sense. So far, so good. Mountain Biking Turned Deadly by Luke.
My name is Luke and I am now 20 years old. This story happened to me when I was 17. This experience still gives me chills to this day. In May 2017, I found myself going out a lot more on my mountain bike. I was getting bored of cruising around the streets, so I wanted to go out for a trail, woodland bike ride. I have never been to Lee Woods before then. Personally, I do not think I will ever go alone again. After some research into different areas, Lee Woods seemed to be the best bet. Living only a couple of miles away was a nice bike ride. On arriving, it looked very peaceful, and I was almost in a dreamlike state by my first look at the place. For a woodland area in England, let alone Bristol, it was amazing. On going into the woods, I remembered seeing different colors at the start of each trail, signifying difficulty for bikers and length for walkers. Don't take my word on that bit, I still have no clue what they mean, honestly. So I decided to go down the blue-colored trail to see what was down there. Finding it exciting, I decided to go down the harder trail, and now, here's where it starts to get weird. I began having this weird sort of vision looking around as if I'm being swallowed by the woodland. Everything felt like it was getting bigger and further away. I brushed it off, but it turns out I lost track of time. I got lost in the trail. Now keep in mind I am very observant and aware of my surroundings. I then came to a strange opening. I could go left in the rough direction of the way out or right deeper into the woods. Me being me, I decided to go deeper into the woods. I came to a weird little trail that just had Dodgy written all over it, metaphorically speaking. I went against my gut feeling of turning back and went down there. I came to a point of which the trail continued, but it was getting very dangerous. The trail being too bumpy for me to even walk down. I then turned back. But for a few minutes before turning back, I do not know why, but I was just standing still, staring down the trail. I felt like I was being watched from all angles, even though it would be near impossible to have that many eyes surrounding me in that area. I got nervous and began walking back up the hill as I was too tired to ride at this point. Keep in mind, my bike tires are completely solid, with no punctures, slow punctures, or even anything wrong at all. I wish I still had the pictures of the bike. Upon getting back to the spot where I originally went to the trail, that weird loss of time thing began. It felt as if the whole path had stretched by a half a mile, as if the woodland was moving. I began walking up the path feeling that same eerie sensation of being watched as I did beforehand. This time, it felt a bit more sinister. It felt as if something were about to happen. Bearing in mind, I had not seen a single person now since I went down that first trail. I will explain the scenery before continuing. It is a long path, a slightly steep hill to my left, a narrow river to my right, maybe 4 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Bushes are on the other side of the river, with the odd tree every now and then. Upon getting about a quarter of the way up the slowly inclining path, I hear a woman crying behind a tree up ahead. I start slowing down my walking pace to try and get a look behind the tree, but the whole time I am thinking to myself, why would someone jump across to cry behind a tree? So I edge closer to the river to look behind to see if the person is okay. Also because many people go to Lee Woods to commit suicide, so I was hoping that maybe I could help this person. But you guessed it, there is no one there and the crying stopped. A bit weirded out, I just slowly turned away and started walking again, a bit quicker as I was unnerved. I have had a few paranormal experiences before this, but not in a place like this, never in the woods. Usually it was in a house or some sort of building, so this was new to me. I had this sudden shiver as I was walking. Maybe a minute or so later, only a couple of meters away where I heard the crying, it started again, but this time it was opposite of me across the river. I did not bother looking. I started just going again in a bit of a jog. As I got faster, I heard the bushes rustling, as if there was something following me. Upon hearing this, I sped up and the crying became more and more hysterical. Bear in mind, my bike was fine before this moment in time. I have thought to myself, F this, I'm gone. I try to hop on my bike with the adrenaline that was rushing through me, and I come to an almost sudden stop. My back tire on my bike had become completely flat out of nowhere, so I had no other choice but to sprint with my bike and pray for the best, and that I do not trip or end up having to throw it and run faster. With the crying person still close to me and keeping up, I am running faster and faster, praying I just get off this path that I was on. I had that feeling of wanting to cry because I could not actually do anything to help the situation or get out of it any faster. And after what felt like an hour but was probably only 5 or 10 minutes, I could see the car park. The crying had stopped following me and getting closer and started moving back down to where I first heard it. I sprinted out into the car park. I must have been as white as a sheet of paper and hysterical with my breathing and wheezing as multiple people in the car park turned to look at me like I was crazy. I saw the exit sign out of the car park and ran towards it, and whilst doing so, I noticed my bike to be moving a lot smoother. I could not believe that my bike tire had suddenly regained all of its air. It was solid again, as it was before the unnerving crying person shenanigans. I jumped on my bike and got away from Lee Woods as fast as I could, and have never gone back, as every person I tell this story becomes more reluctant to go there with me. The thing that makes this story so scary to me is I have Irish heritage. In Irish folklore, there is a demon that we call the Banshee. She is seen in woodlands next to rivers and lakes washing blood off clothes. It is said that if you see her washing blood off clothes, the person who owns those clothes will die. Alternatively, if you hear her crying, it means death. I cannot remember the meanings exactly of the deaths, but it means either you or a loved one will die. Since 2017, I have lost my auntie, 2 of my best friends, and a dog. Lee Woods is no joke. There are many stories that have come out of Lee Woods too. You can read online about them. Search up Lee Woods, Leigh. It is rated 87th most haunted place in the UK according to Higgypop. It is a popular spot in Bristol for suicides, or it was at least. Even the ghost of Isambard Kingdom Brunel has been spotted there, looking over the suspension bridge, which he designed. I may submit some more stories soon, as I have a couple of more experiences I have had over the years.
The Invisible Creature on the Roof by Swamp Dweller. Now, this story isn't a rock climbing story, but it is a personal story of mine that I wanted to share with you all. I shared this in a video many years ago, but I'd like to share it for anybody who's new. I grew up in rural areas my entire life. Whether it was beef farms in Tennessee or living in the middle of nowhere, Florida, I've done it all, really. Growing up without access to most commonalities we have all grown accustomed to. That's right, we had no internet, no TV, and you guessed it, no cell phones. I know, the horror. We are the last actual generation before the internet age, I like to think. Dial-up was around, but it was something most of us didn't have access to at the time. But honestly, it wasn't all that bad outside of the long, dull summer days when we would be cooking alive in the fields picking green beans. Living in an old Civil War cabin in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, shelled out some exciting experiences. This story will be one of the many I may share if you all enjoy it. This story starts like any other. It was a typical Friday night and my brothers and I were home alone. As we didn't have much to entertain ourselves with, we began playing search in and around the house, which is basically like hide and seek. We mostly opted to stay indoors as it was pitch black outside. For more context, our cabin was on a steep hill with a long winding driveway. Our place had a basement level, the main level where most of the house was, and the upstairs that only had my room. We also had a back deck that was about 10 to 12 feet in the air. Anyway, back to the story at hand. It was pitch black outside, and going much further than the front porch at that time was something many of us didn't want to do. The game was fun but needed more variety, and with the little room we had inside, it did get kinda stale. At this point, I thought of wandering outside and hiding on the roof to make the game a bit more interesting. This would soon be one of my biggest regrets in life. At first, everything did seem fine. It was rather cold as it was nearing fall and the weather was starting to change. There was a slight breeze and the air was crisp and calming. After a few minutes of sitting on the roof, something felt off. I had been practically mesmerized by the sound of crickets and cicadas. I realized, though, that all the noise had suddenly stopped. This to me seemed very odd, but at the same time, being a naive teenager, I didn't realize that this only meant something terrible was going to happen. I sit there as still as possible for a moment, trying to listen as closely as I can. I can't hear anything besides the slight breeze through the leaves. Then, an eruption of noise came from the other end of the roof as quickly as the silence came. For a bit more detail, we had a metal roof, making it very easy to hear when things walk on top of it. It sounded like something had landed on the opposite end of the roof. I looked over but could see nothing. This left me somewhat unnerved, and my first thought was to exit the situation. However, before panicking fully, I remembered it could be my brothers messing with me, since they did probably give up looking for me by now inside. I opened up my window and called my brothers. They both ran up the stairs shouting and complaining that the roof was off limits. As my oldest brother got to me, I asked him if he had been messing with me and making noise on the roof. He, of course, denied this and wanted to come up and investigate. So he and I slowly made our way to the middle of the roof and listened, just for a moment. Everything went quiet around us as it had earlier. At this point, I was already on edge, ready to karate chop a demon in the neck if I had to. Then, we hear what sounds like a pounding noise on the far end of the roof, in the opposite direction of where we are standing. After 3 sets of 6 pounding noises, it charged us. Well, I think it did anyway. It sounded like hooves were running on the metal roof, but the only issue was we couldn't see a damn thing. The entire roof was clear, aside from us, that is. But somehow we heard these footsteps. It quickly approached us and began running circles around us. I held out my arms, trying to see if I could feel anything, but I couldn't. The weirdest part is that I could feel the vibrations of something running around us, but I could see nothing tangible. The footsteps circled us for many minutes, but was probably no more than a minute at most. Suddenly, it ran off to the other side of the roof and seemingly jumped and disappeared into thin air. We quickly ran inside, locked the windows and doors, and huddled up inside, freaked the hell out. To this day, I still don't really know what I experienced, but I can tell you this: there are things we cannot explain out there in this world, and this was one of the many experiences I've had that definitely reaffirms that. Possible Dogman Encounter by Richard. This story happened a few years ago, and I've been sitting on it for quite some time. I live in Ottawa, Lake Michigan. I moved into the house sometime around 2015 after my grandmother passed away. It's a decent-sized, single-story ranch that sits on an acre of land, and on 2 sides of the house, the front and back, are large patches of woods that take up 40 acres or more. These woods have dark secrets, including a time when a local murder occurred back in the 70s, but that will be for another story. This area has been quite overdeveloped in the last few years, but the woods have never been touched. However, there is now talk of them being cleared for houses, so I decided to share this story before it's lost forever. Now, it's essential to know the layout of this house. It is 3 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, and the bedroom I sleep in, my grandmother's old room, is on the east side of the house, facing the woods. It has 2 windows facing the woods and 1 on the back. For some odd reason, the east side of the house is very, very close to the woods, but I'm still trying to figure out why. Anyway, it was a warm summer evening, about 6:45 p.m., and the sun was just starting to set. I just arrived home and pulled up the long driveway into the garage. I parked, shut the garage door behind me, and went into the small door that goes into the den. That's when I noticed something was off. I usually could hear the well pump in the crawl space beneath me running or the boiler clicking on and off, but there was nothing. It was dead quiet, and the air felt thick. I turned the lights on and couldn't figure out why it was so peaceful there. It's also important to note that you'd usually hear many motorcycles going by or Cessna planes, since there was a small airport just up the road, but there was no sound at all. I sat down to watch TV and eat dinner, and noticed the TV was unbelievably quiet. I turned it up to 100, and could still barely hear it. I chalked it up to lousy TV reception since it was an antenna TV, and finished eating. I cleaned up, walked through the kitchen to the hallway, and went to the bathroom to fill the bathtub. As I made my way down the hallway, I suddenly felt an overwhelming dread wash over me, but I tried to brush it off. I went into the bathroom and began filling the tub. The faucet was unbelievably quiet again while I was filling the tub, and I was getting a bit creeped out. I walked into the bedroom to grab my clothes out of the closet, which had one of the windows facing the woods just to the right of it. I was rummaging around the closet getting my clothes out when I suddenly wanted to look out the window. When I did, I wish I hadn't. Just as the tree line was as tall, this muscular creature was there. It was 6 feet tall. It was well built with broad shoulders, and it had gold and silver fur. It looked like it had golden eyes as well, and a head resembling a Doberman but slightly more extensive and filled. It had large muscular arms and a massive hand, with tiny claws surprisingly. I could see it clearly, and it looked at me blankly. I noticed it also had very long, thick fur and a long tail. It was similar to one that like an alligator would have. It looked like it was at least 4 feet long and went down to the ground and out a little bit. This creature looked well kept and not very dirty. As I hear in most stories of animals like this, they usually seem kind of dirty and disheveled. Now, since it was summer, I had the bedroom windows open. I listened to the creature snort, turning around and disappearing back into the deep of the woods. Immediately the quiet went away and I could suddenly hear everything just fine again, including the tub running in the bathroom. That night I made sure all the doors and windows were locked and turned on all 6 outside lights, including the old floodlight in the backyard that never got used. I didn't really sleep well that night. I had no idea what that creature was or what it wanted. It strangely didn't make me feel necessarily afraid when I looked at it. I just felt unsure. I have no idea if it wanted to hurt me or not. The following week, I replaced almost all of the outside lights with floodlight cameras and installed an alarm on the house. I now own a shotgun, and for quite some time after that, I never saw it again and almost forgot about it. Until the following summer, which was a warm June summer night. After having some buddies playing pool in the basement, I had just finished cleaning up the house. I just shut the kitchen light off and headed to the bedroom. I got in bed and went to sleep. Now it's essential to know that this house doesn't have central air, and I had a window unit in the bedroom. And since it was about 90 degrees out that day, I had it turned on. Anyway, I woke up at around 3 a.m. for seemingly no reason. I heard what sounded like scratching from the air conditioner, but figured it was probably the unit making noise. I was about to fall back asleep when suddenly the air conditioner shifted and moved slightly in the window. Immediately I got my shotgun out from under my bed and pressed the panic button on the alarm system, which was just above the headset that I was sleeping under. It set off an alarm outside the house and the noises stopped. I stayed in the bedroom until the sheriff arrived, which took about 35 minutes since I lived so far away from the sheriff's department. Eventually, when he arrived, I told him what happened, and he searched the property. I remember installing a security camera on that side of the house and checking the footage. This side of the house didn't have any light, and the night vision on the camera wasn't so great, but when we looked, we did see a big, tall, broad silhouette of some sort of creature moving away from the house back towards the woods. The sheriff thought it might be a bear, but we don't have bears around here. We do have coyotes and a few stray mountain lions, but nothing this large. The sheriff left and I went back to sleep. The following day, I looked all around the house. I couldn't find a single track, nothing. It was like this thing had never even existed. What I did notice though is towards the beginning of the woods, the trees looked like they had massive gouges in them, like something with massive hands was ripping into them. I've checked my cameras every single day since then, and I haven't caught anything. I do occasionally hear sounds around my house, but I have yet to see it again. I don't know what the heck this creature is that's living in the woods near my house, but I hope I don't have to find out.
I've lived in this town all of my life. I know all the weird traditions that come with living in a place as remote as mine. But nothing explains what's happened at our deer park. I used to come out here most evenings during the pandemic, park up by the base of the hill overlooking the sanctuary and just immerse myself in nature. I was always mindful of the distance I had to keep from the deer, particularly during mating season, and it wasn't like the deer didn't know what a car was. These were in their own reserve, sure, but the trail cut right through their vast fields, and they'd grown accustomed to seeing cars all manner of times in day and evening, which is what made the situation much more unsettling. Starting last week, a sign was put up on the entrance gate to the park. Impossible to miss as the cars slowed and the tires rolled over the metal grates. With it being the late hours and very few cars on the road, I decided to stop and read it in full. A polite notice to our valued visitors entering the Oboro Nature Reserve. Our deer are exhibiting unusual behaviors, and we are politely requesting you observe the following guidelines in place as to best protect yourself and the well-being of our deer. 1. While the park is open 24 hours a day, we are recommending visitors do not stop their cars during observable grazing periods and on midsummer nights. You are welcome to drive through and observe from a distance, but please do not slow down or stop. 2. Should you be slowed or stopped at any other time and the deer be curious by your vehicle, act calmly and do not speed up. Let them inspect you and judge you as a safe passerby. If they begin snorting, that is your cue to leave. 3. There have been reports of deer standing on their hind legs and remaining idle in the fields. These rumors are a fallacy. Please do not pay attention to them. 4. There is a black stag that holds dominion over the western herd. His antlers are sharp and his stride is impressive, but do not attempt to approach him. Please pay him the respect you would normally and do not stare at any of the females in his harem. He will charge you. Bucks are not friendly. 5. Deer remember faces. They can recognize you from a distance and will verify your smell as you get closer, listening intently the entire time. There are many of them and only one of you. You would do well to mind that. 6. Lastly, no matter what salacious rumors have been propagating amongst the community, the deer are not congregating in the dead of night. Deer are social animals that sleep and graze together in a herd. This is normal. The deer are acting normally. Drive safely, keep your doors locked, and have a lovely drive in the Oboro Nature Reserve. Strange, right? The notice wasn't your usual steel sign with carefully embossed wording. Rather, it had been hastily marked up and nailed to the wall adjacent to the welcome sign, as if in a hurry. I'd not heard any sorts of rumors around town, and nobody had complained about the deer park at all. We're a population of maybe 2,000, so it's not very difficult for word to get about. Still, I had my routine and intended to stick to it. Some of the info was valuable for newcomers. There was indeed a large buck who paraded the western herd. His name was Jojo, and I fully believed he would gore anyone who outstayed their welcome or got too close. Beautiful specimen of muscle and authority. He ensured his harem would never be straying too far from him, and he seemed to be borderline obsessive about making sure they never went across the eastern side where the large swaths of trees were at. In fact, I'd observed him on multiple occasions actively nudging or ramming younger males away from the split in the road and back to safety. On the rare occasion that a member of the herd crossed the line, he would refuse to acknowledge them and actively keep them away from entering back, as if they were banished. As I drove through the archway, I'd realized I had not seen many deer in the eastern section of the park. Looking out my window and staring at the makeshift forest to my right and a burning question coming to the forefront of my mind that didn't leave as I reached the hill overlooking both sides of the hill. Where are the rest of the deer? It was, to say the least, unnerving to sit there and try to enact my ritual of riding under a clear night when there was a strict absence of the herd where they should be. I tried my best to focus, but something was just burning in my mind, pulling my eyes back to look at that same spot, time and time again. Eventually, I decided that I needed to get some fresh air and take a better look, satiate my curiosity, and then, with my mind at ease, I can get back to finishing my blog. The air is humid when I step outside. No breeze and the stars are out on full display. Thank goodness for no light pollution in the countryside. I leave the engine running and walk to the barrier my car is parked in front of, leaning over and taking a pair of binoculars I bring for slower days when I want to see the deer in better detail. As I direct my vision to the eastern herd,
I see something darting in the tree line. It's quick, hairy, and seemed to move the second my binoculars motioned toward it. Even a deer shouldn't be that spooked, especially from this distance. My joints seize up and I dang near drop the binoculars when I hear a familiar snorting from behind me. I turn and see Jojo, standing 15 feet from me, just by the rear of my car, and his eyes gleaming in my rear lights. His head is low, and his antlers are thick, sharp, and aimed at me. In that moment, I don't know if he was going to charge and whether I should be fighting for my life or not. Instead, I do as I was instructed and stay still, not making sudden movements as he snorts again, closing the gap between us slowly. As he gets within 5 feet of me, he rears his head up. I see the most baffling expression on his face for a fleeting moment. Fear. Something ripples through the eastern forest, and birds begin flying away in droves. Some of the deer herd in the western area are circling something, and Jojo immediately bounds down and out of sight to control the chaos. I waste no time getting in my car and driving down after them, keeping the doors locked, the windows open a crack, and my speed at a decent crawl. As I come along the embankment that connects to the road, I see Jojo running full sprint towards another deer. He knocks the rival over and contorts the body as it skids across the grass and falls into the trail just ahead of my car. I know I'm not supposed to, but I stop the car and wait. In a choice between breaking the rules and breaking my car, I choose the former any day. The western herd deer under Jojo's command are gathering behind him, making horrific shrieks of terror. Jojo strides up and bows his head again in front of the still contorted deer, antlers on full display and dripping with black blood. It was a clear threat. Do not come back here if you value your life. I started wondering how I'd safely get this deer out of the way, or if I could mount the grass on the other side and go around it, when I saw something horrific unfold in front of my eyes. The body twisted itself around, and the limbs snapped to reset themselves. The head still cracked at an ugly angle, bones sticking out of the sides as it got into its shaking legs. Then it screamed. It sounded as if its lungs were filled with blood, a horrible muted cry of anguish that backed up every other deer but Jojo. I don't know what was keeping this thing standing, but it let its head flop lazily around as it carefully backed away onto the eastern side of the reserve before bounding into the tree line, as if nothing were wrong. My rational mind chalked it up to the adrenaline and instinct to survive, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that something was entirely wrong. I carried on driving as soon as the deer was out of sight, not looking at Jojo or the others as I carried on down the trail. For the remaining few minutes, I felt unseen eyes staring intently at me until I crossed the threshold and back into civilization. I'd never been more grateful to see other humans. Or my bed. Something about the whole incident just took everything out of me. I was drained of all of my energy. As I slept that night, I dreamt that I was a deer alongside Jojo, frolicking in the herd and grazing peacefully. But as I cast my eyes upward to the sky, a bitter chill on the wind, I saw the moon bathed in an almost purple plume. A strange light cast onto the land and noises rustling from the woods opposite. I don't know how I knew this, but something in me instinctively knew we were not supposed to go there. I saw shapes begin to emerge from the trees, and that same horrible shriek rang out again as I woke up in a sweat. I leaned forward to catch my breath and grab a glass of water. As I changed positions to reach for my nightstand, I swear I heard something running up the trail to my house. I was probably still half asleep, maybe just imagining it, but that didn't make it any more unnerving. I decided it would be best to drive out the next night and confront my concerns head on, take the bull by the horns, or the deer by the antlers. If I'm not going to sleep soundly, then I should use my time wisely and document what I'm seeing. Maybe pass it to the rangers in the morning, right? When I drove back out there last night, the atmosphere was vastly different. A mist was enshrouding the trail, and most of the deer on the western side were huddled together, shaking and staring intently at the other side of the nature reserve. I couldn't see Jojo anywhere. Strange, I thought. Alpha males patrol their herds dutifully. Why wasn't he here? I parked up at the usual spot, making sure he wasn't around. I pulled out my binoculars again and stared at the eastern area, the clouds beginning to part as the moon shone through. There was movement all along the tree line as shapes began emerging one by one. I think it took my mind a moment to process what I was seeing. I'd finally seen the deer on the eastern side, but they were wrong. Very, very wrong. Standing on their hind legs and taking confident, awkward steps, they marched out of the trees with their heads craned to the sky. All of them emitting that horrible sound like their heads were being held underwater as they screamed. It reverberated in my ears and made my skin break out in goosebumps. There were dozens of them, maybe a couple of hundred. Some were dragging a structure with them, others hauling a writhing shape I couldn't quite see. They congregated in a small huddle, the center of which was obscured from my vision. I looked over to Jojo's herd and saw the fear in their eyes, so many of them shaking with their teeth bared. A primal fear we humans have largely lost in the safety of being the dominant species. But this night showed me we were not as powerful as we think we are. As the huddle broke away and began walking towards the edge of their field, I saw what they had been huddling around. Jojo. He was still alive but barely moving and breathing. His eyes glazed over. When he began to come to, he started shrieking like a fawn. It was unnerving. They dragged him to the structure, a primitive set of steps, and hollowed out a hole in its center, coated in a thick substance on the sides, just large enough for Jojo to be thrown into. I watched these things, these not deer, use their front hooves to hoist him up into the hole, his screaming incessant the entire time. They stood around it, their necks cracked as they stared at the moon and shrieked. I looked up with them, wondering if what they sought was up there in the skies, a kind of primitive god for these creatures. I should have known better, of course. Whatever god these deers prayed to, it didn't reside up above. No. It lurked deep below. A low groan called out in response. It possessed the same blood-filled lungs these monstrosities had, and Jojo's deer huddled closer together at its roar. Jojo had stopped moving, his crying completely gone as the not deer fell silent and formed a circle around their altar, snorting in unison. It grew to a fever pitch before something began dragging Jojo from beneath, ripping at his limbs and pulling until a horrific squelch indicated the top had separated from the bottom. The hole spurted out blood and chunks of deer as the not deer celebrated, danced in the rain, and feasted on the pieces. One final roar rang out from the unseen creature. It shook the ground, and I felt my balance waver for just a moment, steadying myself on the car. I know I should have booked it out of there, but I was desperate to understand what I was seeing. Rationalizing that perhaps this was a bizarre art piece, maybe a protest from some sort of animal rights group or even a bunch of edgy satanic teens. But the rational voice in my head grew very, very quiet when I grabbed my binoculars to look again. Every single one of them were staring up at me, emotionless, black eyes fixated on my position. I didn't wait any longer. I drove out of there at a breakneck pace, not looking at either side of the park on my exit, and near coming off the road with the lack of traction. As I got to the archway, my tire smashing against the grate, I'd inadvertently attracted the forest ranger on duty. He pulled me over and walked up to my window, a friendly smile on his face. "You know there's a speed limit there for a reason, right, son?" Yeah, I'm sorry. I got a little spooked is all," I smiled back. Nerve shot to hell, he raised an eyebrow. "You didn't break one of the rules now, did you?" "Oh no, I kept to them. It's just, well, Jojo got attacked by the eastern deer, and I don't think he's doing well. It was just a shock to take in. I figured telling a half-truth would be best. Couldn't exactly say what I thought I'd really seen, could I?" "That's so. Well, they make their choices carefully. We don't know much, but we do not want to interfere. This is how it's always been. Animals have strange practices. You get how it is. But so long as you didn't look at them, and they didn't look at you, you're fine. Deer remember faces after all. Thanks for visiting. Drive safe." He smiled again and tipped his hat before walking off to his station. My blood ran cold. I couldn't get those words out of my head the entire drive home. But so long as they didn't look at you, you're fine. I've not stepped outside my house since that night. I live in a remote part of the village, and while I enjoy my privacy, it's been a hotbed for strange noises and unsettling emotion. Everywhere I go in my home, I feel like I'm being watched by those same vacant eyes. What happens now? What happens to those they look at? I can't get their eyes out of my head, and I can't sleep. I can't sleep at all. This isn't going to end until I figure out what they want. I wish I had more for you. I wish I could tell you more. I wish I could tell you what the Not Deer were, what they prayed to, why they sacrificed, what the Ranger knew. But there's so many unknowns that it makes my head spin. It's just like being deep in the woods. So many twists and turns, you never know which is the right path and which is the path to death. You never know what danger lurks behind every tree. I don't know what the deer are doing. I don't know what is going on at that park. But if you value your life, you'll stay far, far away from it and whatever monster they're praying to. There's something wrong with the deer on our nature reserve. They started standing up.
Tacoma Ghost Story by Mick. I'm a city boy from a city where the most significant wildlife you would find are probably squirrels. When I left the army and moved to Tacoma in an apartment near the community college, I was amazed at how many deer I saw weaving around the front yards and along the green belts around the town. One night, in the middle of summer, around 2 a.m., because that's where the bars close, I was walking home, slightly drunk but aware of my surroundings. That was a safe part of town back then, but there was no reason to take any chances. I saw 3 coyotes rush onto the sidewalk in front of me, and then they all stopped. All 3 of them just stared at me for a moment, and then looked behind them into the narrow tree line, acting kind of nervous. I've never seen more than 1 coyote at a time before, and certainly not in the suburbs. Being the big, arrogant drunk I am, I simply clapped my hands loudly a few times and quickly said, "Go on, get out of here." They did not run back into the tree line away from me. They trotted towards me initially, then crossed the street to avoid me, then sprinted past me as fast as they could. So now, I'm kind of wondering, what is with the narrow stretch of trees? What scared the coyotes away so quickly that they just ran past me in the street? I was a bit more curious than spooked. So when I got near the spot that they ran away from, I turned on my phone flashlight and started poking around. That's when I saw, or at least I thought I saw, a kid wearing a parka and boots running around, waving a stick around in each hand. In the middle of the night, in the middle of summer, all alone. It was like a kid around preschool age just frolicking around carefree. The kid very briefly glanced at me and then effortlessly disappeared into some blackberry bushes, which is no easy feat for a grown man with a machete, let alone a kid. I've never felt so weird in my life. I know I was slightly drunk and no one will believe me, but I called the police non-emergency number anyway. I reported that 3 coyotes were acting weird to let animal control know, and then I lost my nerve before mentioning the ghostly child running around. My eyes had barely left the place from where that demon kid thing had disappeared from, but I watched him disappear right in front of my eyes. I don't really know how to explain this experience other than it had to have been some sort of ghost. I Am No Longer a Skeptic by Anonymous. I would like to start by saying that while I am interested in the paranormal, I tend to be skeptical and prefer to think things out rationally before dismissing every little thing as a ghost or the like. This experience, however, has no logical explanation I can think of. I am new here, and as well, I apologize in advance if I'm not doing this correctly. So, let's get into this. I was 17 and it was mid-October, nearing Halloween. My family had gone to a small, rural town to meet up with some good friends. We were going to get dinner and catch up for old time's sake, as my siblings and I had grown up with the children of the other families. After dinner, the parents stayed at the bar drinking, and those of us who were not of legal drinking age were starting to get a little bored. That is when one of my friends brought up the local cemetery. Apparently there is a cemetery in this town that is said to be haunted. I'm pretty positive that some ghost hunter paranormal type show did an episode about it or something, but the legends are said to have been around since before that. The story goes that a group of teenage boys were wandering into the graveyard one Halloween night with the intention of causing trouble and maybe stirring up some spooky ghost action in celebration of Halloween. After messing around for a while with no unexplained phenomena,
they decided to sit in on top of the mausoleum, which is basically just a big tomb built up around a coffin instead of burying it in the ground. They were about to call it quits and head home when suddenly, unseen hands seemed to push one of the boys off the top of the tomb and into the ground. All the boys were obviously scared and hightailed it out of there, all of them feeling an eerie, ominous energy following them around for weeks after the incident. There have also been numerous reports of orbs, headstones inexplicably moving or disappearing altogether, ghostly apparitions, inscriptions being changed, flashes of light, strange noises, the whole works. I, of course, was more than excited to check it out. We arrived at the cemetery well after dark, and one of my girlfriends, we will call her Emma, and I were the only two brave ones enough to go in. We hopped right out of the car, careful to be as inconspicuous as we could since we did not want the police showing up and ruining our ghost hunting experience. We headed toward the entrance. It was chilly and a bit windy, as autumn in Wisconsin tends to be. We gripped each other's hands and started down the gravel path. As soon as we passed the fence that surrounded the plot of land, everything seemed to get very still and very quiet. We could not even hear the wind anymore, which was strange as it had been breezy as we got out of the car. It was so silent that even whispering and our steps in the gravel seemed, pun absolutely not intended, loud enough to wake the dead. Though there were no lights in or near the cemetery, there was enough moonlight filtering through the clouds to allow us to see well. We soon realized we had no idea where the fabled haunted mausoleum was, but kept walking anyway. We made a random left turn, and lo and behold, there it was, about 30 yards or so in front of us. Surprisingly, we had great luck, right? I don't think so. As we approached, I began to feel almost an electric sort of energy in my fingers and hands, but I wrote this off as just nerves or something due to breaking the law. We reached the tomb, and this thing is absolutely huge. It was easily twice my height, at the very least, and made of weathered gray stone with moss and lichen growing sparsely on it. We stare at it for a moment, and Emma whispers, "You should touch it." Being the big bad ghost hunter I am, I oblige. There is really nothing remarkable about the cool roughness of the stone, so I decide to take it a step further and hop up to sit up on the lip of the curved top of the thing. Again, nothing happens, so I jokingly whisper shout, "If there's anyone here, any spirits or anything, come on out." After listening in silence for a second or two, I think, F it, and make my way to the very top where the kid is rumored to have been pushed off by ghostly hands. I have Emma snap a photo or two of me before climbing back down. Slightly disappointed by the lack of spooky encounters, we agree to head out and are about to do just that when we see a pair of headlights slowly creeping down the road that borders one side of the graveyard. We immediately assume someone noticed us and called the cops, so we crouch down behind some bushes with the mausoleum directly to our left. Both of us are completely silent except for our breathing as we watch the vehicle slowly make its way down the street. I am watching its tail lights turn the corner when I hear a low, creepy, menacing laugh coming from right behind me. It sounded so strange, like it was a few feet away but also right in my ear at the same time. I'm freaked out, and I'm about to chalk it up to adrenaline-induced hallucination, when Emma, who is standing to my left, whispers, "Hey, did you hear that?" My blood ran cold, as I slowly nod a silent, "Yes, I did." I cautiously turn my head to one direction, and try to see if I can hear it. I kid you not. I didn't hear anything, but what I did see was a dark figure stand up from behind one of the headstones not 10 feet away from us. I scream bloody murder and somehow end up on the ground as the next thing I know, Emma is pulling at my arm shouting, "We have to run! We need to get out of here, come on!" I let her pull me to my feet and lead me blindly by the hand. We are full out sprinting, tripping over gravestones and plants and who knows what else in the dark. We cannot even find the exit in our panic. We finally reach a gap in the fence and I can feel the tears streaming down my face as I run for my life down the middle of the road, not even paying attention to the oncoming headlights until I nearly run into them. Luckily, it was the car containing the rest of our friends,
and we rip the door open and throw ourselves inside screaming, "Go, go, please just drive," before we even bothered to sit in an actual seat or shut the door. I cannot for the life of me remember who was driving, but I think our panic and terror shook them enough that they did exactly what we asked of them and sped away back to the bar. They kept asking us what happened and if we were okay, but we would not calm down enough to answer them until we were back inside the bar and sat down. Still shaking and out of breath, we recounted our story to all of them, drunk parents included. I think a lot of them were skeptical, and honestly, I would have been too if I had not experienced it myself. In the weeks that followed, I felt the same eerie energy the boys in the legend describe hanging over my head. Personally, I attribute it more to paranoia after being scared out of my mind by something I could not actually see, but it made me feel uneasy nonetheless. It has been a few years since this happened, and I still cannot think of a single, logical explanation for what actually happened that night. While I have no idea how credible anyone else's reported experiences on this show are, I know we were without a doubt the only people in that graveyard, or even on the streets for that matter, and we would have heard someone trying to sneak up on us. The sound of that laugh was so unnatural. I cannot get it out of my head. Even now, I have never been more scared than I was that night, and I now know what people mean when they talk about not being able to fully believe in the paranormal until you have experienced it firsthand. Anyway, I just thought I would share this experience with you. I hope you enjoyed it. I Tried to Ghost Hunt by Anonymous. In 2009, I was interested in the paranormal, since I had many paranormal experiences growing up. I found a website that held ghost tours at the old Southwestern General Hospital. I was excited and ready to go on a ghost hunt. The group that held the ghost tour was named Ghost, or Ghost Hunters of South Texas. The group was professional, and they used many of the items that paranormal researchers used at the time. Before the tour, they showed us proof that they have captured in previous investigations while investigating the property. EVPs included a little boy saying, "Play with me, please," and a woman with a southern accent responding to questions. The woman is said to be in an old-time dress, and sometimes old-time nurse attire. After the tour, the group said they were having openings for new members, and the new members would be tested and would be considered in maybe being part of the new team. I was quick to join and try out. I made the team. The team would have private group ghost hunts, so we would have the building to ourselves. The third floor was used as a hospice type of area. The building has 4 floors. The first, second, and fourth floor were left abandoned, and they looked like a scene out of a horror movie. Hospital beds lay in rooms dusty and unused. Many had dates from 1995 and before. I even found a death log that had many names and dates. The most active areas were the 4th and 2nd floor. The 4th floor had a baby nursery, and many rooms that were once used for families that would be welcoming new babies. One EVP that was caught in that area was one of crying babies. At the time the EVP was caught, there were no babies in the building, and it was after midnight sometime when it was caught. Also on the 4th floor, there was a long hallway with empty patient rooms. In that hallway, shadows were always seen running or moving. The 2nd floor was an old area. Also, many shadow figures were seen in this area. When doing research on the deaths in the building, I came up with what looked like to be a nurse who was crushed to death when a malfunction with the elevator happened years ago. During the time I was a part of this group, we investigated this building tons of times. I might even care to say maybe over 100. I also led ghost tours in the building with other members. I witnessed shadows, disembodied voices, screams, and one time heard a female humming a song only to find the room empty and dark. I've seen videos of doors opening on their own with no wind or people in the building. Also, the 3rd floor had employees that would see things and hear things very often. Patients also complained of a kid running in their room or a man standing over their bed just looking at them, only to disappear. Over the years, I gained experience and loved what I did.
As a group, we investigated many places such as schools, homes, and cemeteries in El Paso. We also got to investigate the old Asarco smelter before it was demolished several years later. I got to ghost hunt with people from Ghost Hunters and Ghost Hunters International. I met many celebrities, and the group had them take their own personal ghost tours. It was fun, and I grew a thick skin for fearing anything that goes bump in the dark. One of my favorite places to investigate was Southwestern General Hospital. I never believed in being followed home. One night after investigating, I was at my apartment eating on my couch and watching TV. I had my hallway light on near the front door that was visible from where I was sitting. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow of a person on the wall near the door. I turned and saw the shadow in full form. It was about 6 foot tall and completely black. Then, not even a second later, the shadow moved as if it was running down my hallway to my bedroom. I froze in horror, thinking somebody was in my apartment. I got up and walked to my bedroom. Nobody was there. I searched the whole house up and down, and then I thought to myself, maybe I'm just going crazy. I soon went to bed a few minutes later. It was probably about 3:20 a.m. when I felt my bed shaking. I woke up to my sheets being pulled off me very slowly and deliberately. I tried to move, but I just could not. My sheets slid very slowly off me towards the floor. I could not move, and I started to hear growling in my right ear. From the corner of my eye, I could see something moving near my head on the right of me. It was on my pillow. I could only see it from the peripheral vision that it had hair. It was hairy and brown. If I could compare it to something, I would say Chewbacca from Star Wars type hair. It was moving, very slowly, but obviously very deliberately. It was growling as well. My eyes started to water up with tears. I tried to move my arm, but I just couldn't. I could only move my fingers. The blanket was still being pulled off me little by little until it hit the floor and I was no longer covered by my sheet. I felt the hairy thing moving right next to me, and the growling grew louder. Then suddenly, I was able to sit up and I turned and looked to see what was there next to me. The hairy thing was gone, but I could see the imprint of where it had sat right next to me just a moment ago. It was the size of a full-grown cat. Then I looked around the room to gather my sanity. I don't own a cat. My sheet was on the floor, and my eyes were still watery. I asked myself, maybe it was just sleep paralysis. I found it hard to sleep that night, since I lived alone in that apartment. The next day I had a girl over to my apartment. I was seeing her from school. I was playing PlayStation and she asked if she could take a nap in my bed. I said of course. She went to my bed and fell asleep. Around 20 minutes later, she suddenly came back to my living room in tears. She said, I have to leave now. I asked her what was happening and what was wrong. What she said shocked me. She said that something shook the bed and woke her up. She could not move, and then something was growling and started getting close to her ear. Then the bed went down as if somebody lied down next to her. She tried to scream for me and could not. Then she felt as if somebody was breathing on her neck as the growling grew louder. She said it lasted about 2 minutes, and then she was finally able to move. Once she was able to move, she ran to me in the living room. After she explained this, I grabbed her stuff and helped her leave. I did not tell her what happened to me the night before, but I had that same exact experience, and what happened to her was enough proof that something was not right. I could not explain what was happening. First thing that came to mind that something probably followed me home from the hospital. After a few days, all the activity suddenly stopped. Only when I would go in on investigations, I would see shadows in my apartment, and then they would just go away. I loved what I did, and the only time I feared the paranormal was this moment. I no longer ghost hunt, and the group no longer gets together. Southwest General Hospital was purchased and is now remodeled and is in use. I can only imagine what the employees of the LTAC go through by being in that building. Every now and then I drive down Cotton and pass the building. I miss the days of being part of Ghost El Paso. If you are ever in El Paso after stopping by at Chico's Tacos, be sure to pass by the old building by the Star on the Mountain, formerly known as Southwest General Hospital. Hey Swamp Dweller, my name is Michael B.,
and I live in the oldest village in Saskatchewan, before it was Saskatchewan, or before Canada was even a country. We live in the largest delta in Canada, and the second largest in the world. Something that old is obviously going to be haunted, and there's going to be lots of stories about creatures of the night. There are stories of witches, skinwalkers, wetigos, which are basically wendigos. There's been sightings of demons, a man in a trench coat with goat legs, and even the devil himself. For now, I want to talk about a story of a haunted house I lived in. It was used for wake ceremonies before we had halls to host them, and right behind the house was the graveyard. I'll start from the first happening. First, let me tell you about the layout of the front and back doors. Let's say you're standing on the street. You have the front door facing the street, obviously, and stairs leading up to it, with the big bay window next to the front door. The back door is on the side of the house facing the street as well, so you can see in both doors from the street. One day, I was home alone doing chores, and when it was time to do my laundry, I had to go downstairs into the basement to do it. The basement was scary by itself, even if it wasn't haunted because of how old it looked. Whenever I did my laundry, I would always feel like I was being chased up the stairs by something. It honestly felt like there was a face right at the back of my neck the entire time, screaming at me, breathing down my neck. On this day, my brother Jay was coming over to visit since I was home alone. I happened to be coming up from the basement, which pops up right at the back door. So, he saw me walking past the door into the living room. When he saw me walk past the storm door, he said he saw someone walking right behind me. When he gets into the house, he asks me who else is here, and I tell him no one. I've been home alone since this morning. He then tells me that he saw someone right behind me, following me from the basement. It gets worse throughout the months, but I'm oblivious to what's happening because I didn't believe in this stuff at the time. The second happening, I get home from drinking at about 4 a.m. I head into my room to sleep, and as I'm about to fall asleep, I swear I hear what sounds like hooves walking on my ceiling, or maybe even in the attic. It sounded bipedal for sure, heavy, and it stopped right above me. The last thing that happened before I refused to stay in that house was the worst thing. I was coming home after staying at my cousin's house for a couple of days, and seeing that my house was well lit. I assumed someone was home, so I started jogging because it was dark, and mosquitoes like to bite. Remember when I told you there was a big bay window by the front door? Well, the curtains were open, and as I ran up the stairs, I looked inside and saw a black mass sitting on my couch looking out to me. I didn't think anything of it. I thought someone was home. There was a split second from when I see that thing on the couch to when I walked in the house. I walk in and there was no one there whatsoever. I was absolutely creeped out. I started calling out to my mom and walked around the entire house. Nothing. No one was home. I stood in my living room for a second, and that's when it hit me. Who the hell was on my couch? That's when I hear someone walking up the stairs and dread washed over me. I got the hell out of that house and moved out a month later due to unrelated things. These events happened during my second year at university. It was September. The school year was about to start, and I had moved into a high-rise apartment with 3 other girls. Brittany, Morgan, and Natalie. It didn't take long for some sketchy things to start happening. After 2 weeks of living in the apartment, Morgan asked me if I was rolling a ball around at night. I told her it wasn't me, and that she must have been hearing things. We dropped the subject, but that night I started hearing knocking in the vent above my bed. The vent hung below the ceiling, and the opening was perfectly in line where my head would be when I was sleeping. The knocking sound was annoying, and it would only happen at odd hours of the night. I always thought it was probably the sound from the air conditioning turning on, but the knocking sounded strange, almost human and rhythmic, like someone trying to get my attention. Still, I didn't think too much of it and didn't think anything was going on. It was just an odd noise that I could live with, so I told myself. About a week later, I woke up to hear what sounded like a marble rolling on the tile floor above me. It was a distinct sound, and I finally believed Morgan. But I knew there had to be a logical explanation. There were college boys living in the apartment above us, and I figured they were probably messing around. By November, Natalie, Morgan, and I had been hearing the noises every night, but Brittany claimed she had never heard them. One day,
We were making small talk with the building manager, and I mentioned the noises. She said the people who lived in our apartment before heard rolling and knocking sounds as well. She claimed she had electricians come in to fix noises, but I guess it never worked. At this point, we all thought it was funny. We didn't believe in ghosts. Well, I didn't until that night. As we were walking into our apartment, my back was to the living room, and Morgan and Natalie were facing me, so they had a full view of the living room. I jokingly said to them, "Well, it looks like the apartment is haunted." Natalie looked at me, laughed, and said, "Ghosts aren't real." As soon as the last word came out of her mouth, I heard the most gut-wrenching, deafening noise I had ever heard up until that point. Crashing, shattering, and scratching noises erupted from behind me. My heart raced and I saw true terror on Natalie and Morgan's face. Their high-pitched screams pierced my ears and, on instinct, I ran. I didn't even look back one time. I just screamed and ran straight out of the apartment with Natalie and Morgan close behind. We didn't stop until we were one floor away from the lobby, and at that point, we were in tears. It may have been an overreaction, but I thought a maniac had broken into our apartment. Natalie explained that after she had spoken, everything in our apartment crashed onto the floor. She didn't see anyone. All she saw was all of our stuff just flying off. The shelves, the counters. After a while, we calmed down and went back upstairs. Inside of our apartment, all of our pictures, appliances, lights, and decorations were on the ground. Our light fixtures were unscrewed and were hanging by the wires. Some of the cabinet drawers had been left open, and our Christmas lights were twisted around the sofa. We really did try to rationalize what had happened, but we just could not figure it out. We lived in Canada, so there was no earthquake, tremor, or tornado. Brittany had been in the apartment the entire time. When we knocked on the door, she answered and said she had never heard anything happen. I found that very hard to believe. Throughout the year, odd occurrences kept happening. The noises continued. Our lights would turn on and off. Doors would open and close, and sometimes at night we would hear someone mumbling in the hallway. My tolerance level for annoying things got low as exam season approached, so I stopped caring about what was happening. The next year, Natalie, Morgan, and I moved into a different apartment within the same building. We didn't experience anything weird after moving out. I can't help but think that Brittany was to blame for some of this. It's hard to explain, but she was a dark person. I wouldn't put it past her to have messed with us for fun. To this day, I still can't decide if it was something paranormal, Brittany messing with us, or just an odd coincidence. Regardless, it was one of the weirdest and scariest experiences of my life. I just hope I never live in a haunted apartment or haunted house ever again.
Deep South Graveyard Spookiness by John G. The thick, humid air of the Deep South hung heavy around me as I cautiously pushed open the creaking gates of the abandoned graveyard. The moon cast a sickly pallor over the twisted branches of the ancient oaks that surrounded the cemetery, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I had been drawn to this lonely place by rumors and whispers, tales of strange happenings and unexplained disappearances. But as I stepped further into the graveyard, the sense of foreboding grew stronger, prickling at the back of my neck like icy fingers. The ground beneath my feet was uneven and littered with fallen leaves, obscuring the worn paths that were winding their way around these crumbling headstones. I moved cautiously, my sense on high alert, looking for any sign of danger. As I wandered deeper into the graveyard, the silence became oppressive, broken only by distant hoots of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. The shadows seemed to dance and shift around me, playing tricks on my mind and distorting my perception of reality. I reached out to touch one of the headstones, the cold stone sending a shiver down my spine. The inscription was worn and faded, barely legible after years of neglect. It felt like a silent testament to the forgotten souls beneath the earth, their names lost to time. Suddenly, a chill swept through the graveyard. It was like a gust of wind, if you will, like somebody had blown through here, sending a shiver down my spine once more. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to comfort myself and ward away any cold that was seeping into my bones. Then, from the darkness emerged a figure, tall and gaunt, its features obscured by shadows. I froze, my heart pounding as I watched it draw closer, its movement slow and deliberate. I tried to call out, to ask who or what it was, but my voice was caught in my throat, choked off by fear. The figure drew closer until I could see its eyes, cold and empty, devoid of any hint of humanity. And then it spoke, a voice like gravel, harsh and rasping. It spoke of death and despair, of souls trapped in eternal torment. It told of the curse that had been befallen on this place, condemning all who dared to trespass within its boundaries. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling with the terror as I realized the truth of what lay before me. This was no ordinary graveyard. This was a prison, a place of darkness and despair where the dead refused to rest. With a cry of fear, I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing off in crumbling headstones as I fled through the darkness. But no matter how fast I ran, the graveyard stretched endlessly, its twisted paths leading me deeper into its heart. And then, just when I thought I could run no further, I stumbled upon a mausoleum, its doors hanging open, inviting me inside. With nowhere else to turn, I ducked inside, hoping to find refuge from whatever lurked outside. But as I huddled in the darkness of the mausoleum, the whispers grew louder, their words becoming more apparent with each passing moment. They spoke of hunger, pain, and a thirst for vengeance that could never be sated. As I listened, I realized I was not the first to seek the shelter of this cursed place, and I feared I would not be the last. For in the depths of the cold, old abandoned graveyard in the deep south, some things should never be disturbed, things that hunger for the souls of the living, and as I cowered in the darkness, I knew I would potentially never escape the horrors of what lurked within. Luckily, I was able to find my way out in the morning, first light, ran my way home, and have never looked back since. If I was a skeptic of the paranormal or anything otherworldly before this experience, I am now a full-fledged believer. This 1700s graveyard is haunted. By Anonymous. 2 years ago, 2 friends and I decided to go on a late-night adventure and drive to a bigger city about an hour away from our hometown. We got to the town around 11 p.m. and explored random areas. I had my iPhone plugged into the car to play music, and out of nowhere, the music cut out and the screen changes to the maps. Fast forward to a few days ago, when one of my friends that was with me was talking to me on the phone. He brought up the experience, and we decided to look into it. We found the 2 roads on Google Earth, and could see a house in a forest with a clearing around it. We researched the house and found a court document connected to the address. Developers had bought the land and were denied approval to build on the land where the house stood. I didn't really think much of it until I read why they were dismissed. The clearing on Google Earth was a cemetery where the city's original settlers were buried. After some more research, we found out that a man who had owned the land sometime before the 1990s had moved every single headstone, leaving the graves unmarked. It took historians many years to discover the cemetery, and they were granted permission to report it thoroughly. They found 99 grave sites, but 60 were much smaller, meaning they probably belonged to children. The developers had unveiled in court that they would simply move the remains into a corner of a new subdivision without any ceremony. The other road we were brought to was on the other side of the forest, as if it wanted us to drive through from the other side when we didn't take the main road. The weirdest part about this experience was when we noticed the court date was precisely 10 years ago from when we did our research. We found it odd, and it took us a long time to look into what the GPS could have been doing. Like, how did it malfunction? How did it automatically take us there? It literally took us out from the directions we had and put in these new directions by itself. On the 10th anniversary of this case, I honestly believe that our GPS was being manipulated by a spirit that belonged to the graveyard, and they wanted us to know what happened there. work as a cemetery security guard. By Background T. So, I recently started a security job for the graveyard shift. The building was 12 floors, roof access, and 2 parking garages for reference. No one but my partner and I supposed to be in the building overnight. Also, you need a key card to use the elevator or get into the stairwell doors. Anyway, the first night, one of the motion-activated toilets went off when no one was near it. We had to do a bathroom patrol, and it happened right when we opened the door. The whole floor was vacant after we did our sweep. I was doing a patrol from the 12th floor mechanical room just about a week ago. As I left the room and entered the stairwell, the rooftop door was rattled and slightly banged on. I ran up there, and there's absolutely nothing. I assumed it might have just been a bird or some wind. I started my way down, and then the 11th floor door started jiggling the same way. I jogged down because it was my job, and I had to get there anyway. I swiped my key, but there was absolutely no one there, yet again. It was quiet besides toilets and walkie-talkies that went off when we weren't touching them. Last night I was doing bathroom patrol at 4 a.m., listening to my music in one ear. I get to the 11th floor and start to hear footsteps behind me. I pull out the headphones while turning around, preparing to tell them to get out. Yet again, no one is there. But as those footsteps stopped, heavy footsteps were on the floor above me. They stopped above me when I figured out where they came from. After I got out of that floor into the stairwell and shut the door, I heard it sound like it was trying to open, but it wasn't moving. There isn't any wind inside the building, and nothing appears on the security cameras. I might record it tonight, if I'm still determined that I can do that. Sorry for the long story. I just wanted to make sure I got all these details out there. Working in a cemetery like this can be strange. Usually you don't have cemeteries inside buildings. But for a little bit of extra context, because I don't think I explained this well enough, this is an indoor facility that holds ashes of people. So we have people from war vets to just normal people to all kinds of things. And I think the energy in here is just strange. Old Cemetery Hauntings by Rainer G. I've always looked the paranormal side of things to be mostly plausible. However, I've experienced things here and there since I was a kid that I'm confident can't be explained by science or illusion, but only as something otherworldly. Although nothing I've experienced has ever been necessarily disturbing, they have given me a lot to think about. One of these was the most personal and long-lasting experiences I've ever had, and this took place in May of 2014. Just as some background context, I live in Central Florida. Since it is a very touristy state, of course, towns and other areas like to try and brush over the dark history and even erase it by building over top of it, trying to rewrite the narrative around it to be harmless and seemingly squeaky clean. In reality, Florida is the most southern state you can get. The Klan, Manifest Destiny, Civil War battles and skirmishes, Native American tribe displacement and eradication. Well, I guess you could say attempted eradication because obviously the Seminoles are the only unconquered people, but I digress. If you ask the right people, some of the popular tourist attractions around me will tell you the truth about the atrocities there. So yes, it's likely that most of this state has some activity. At the time, I was in the 7th grade, and throughout the year, I had heard about my friend Bryce, who lived out on the beach in a 4-story house. He had the entire attic and top floor to himself. The beach would be another 250 yards out from his house, and next to his house was an empty lot followed by an old graveyard, then apartments and housing. The headstones mostly faced towards the beach, but its entrance was towards the street behind it. I believe this graveyard was one of two things, but I can't remember for sure. It was either formerly a slave graveyard from Civil War times that turned into a segregated graveyard until the 1900s, somewhere between 1900 and 1909, or a Native American graveyard from the displacement projects or wars in the 1810s to 1850s. I'm leaning towards the latter though, because I've never been able to find out more about this graveyard. Bryce had told me about one night he couldn't sleep or something of the sort, and he looked out his window into the pitch black night to see a set of blue, glowing eyes
looking at him from the graveyard. I would like to know what time of night it was. This had likely happened because the graveyard was in the process of being built over. They were laying foundations and uprooting the graves. They were just removing the headstones for most of it, though. They weren't even actually taking the bodies or the bones and moving them, just the stones. Bryce was also a bit naive, but I never got the impression from him that he'd lie about something like this. I was intrigued and wanted to see it for myself. I finally got my chance on May 14th of 2014 on the last day of actual non-examed filled school. When we went on a field trip to a local theme park and ended the day having a party on the beach at Bryce's house. During this party, I made sure to get him to take me over to the side so I could go see it. He left me for a while. I looked at it and took out my for emergencies hand-me-down phone and took some pictures, as I had seen others do online. I truly regret to this day trespassing onto it and looking at these gravestones remaining. But my 13-year-old self didn't think that nothing could happen, you know? During the time I was taking these pictures, I did notice some people walking by on the street, but I'm sure no one was there by the time I took the pictures and left. I didn't see anyone at the time and went about the party, but when I got home and looked over the pictures, I found that there were 3 pictures that I took that clearly had a couple of people in them standing near the front of the gates. From the lower quality images, I could just barely make out that they looked like Native Americans. They were definitely from the Seminole tribe, which was the leading band of Native Americans who fought during those years previously stated in the beginning of the story. I always planned to move those pictures to a different phone over the last 8 years, but only a few weeks ago, back in November, did I remember about these at all. I guess I deleted these pictures or lost them sometime along the way, and of course I know this cliche, but just know they weren't anything special, but I had a weird and genuine, strange experience at a graveyard. The Cemetery Stalker by E. Double Addict. I've been friends with this guy named Ryan for about 8 years now. We met in the 4th grade. We just finished our junior year of high school. He and I have been big fans of random walks, just taking walks and hikes into random areas. We've been doing it for a couple of years now, during the winter, spring, summer, and fall. Safe to say we love taking walks. He lives a few blocks away from a cemetery, and usually we go straight 2 blocks to get there and take a right down a hill. There's this bridge that we have to cross, then there's the cemetery. It's located on a large hill, so it's pretty visible if you're there. We grew distant during our 8th grade year and didn't hang out very much. I became the popular kid, which was shocking since I have always been an introvert. But anyway, I digress. The point I'm making is we only went on a few walks together that year. As a stroke of luck would have it, we would rekindle our friendship the first year COVID hit. We hung out more and more and talked a lot. We started walking to the cemetery and noticed this yellow sports car was always parked there. We didn't really think much of it. Maybe someone was grieving. It's a cemetery after all. We continued walking there, and the yellow car was at the same spot every single time we went. The lights were always turned off. It just sat there for hours at a time. Again, we didn't really think much of it, I guess. After becoming a little more distant my sophomore year, we began hanging out more during the beginning of our junior year. We went to the cemetery like usual, and there was that same yellow car as always. It was just there doing nothing. We both knew it wasn't a worker since the vehicle was parked in the middle of the path he would drive through, not like at a parking lot or on the side of the road or anything. But we still carried on. Fast forward to May of 2022, we were just about to finish our junior year. We went to the cemetery sometime around 9 p.m. Since I got a job at a pizza place in January, I always worked from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. every weekday except Thursday. We walked like usual, talking about true crime, how dry our love lives are, and the movies that were coming out soon. This time, however, we noticed the car wasn't there. The cemetery has a lot of hills and stretches out, maybe a few thousand graves with still more room to go. You have to walk up a mountain to get to the main area, actually, and most of the graveyard is still not visible because of the hills. We continue walking to where the car usually parks since we've never actually been there. We continued talking about our lives and just silly nonsense when we noticed a car driving in the path.
We didn't think much of it, again this is a place of grieving, but we saw that it was yellow. When it came close to us, the same type of headlight, same license plate, it was dark then, so we had to rely on our flashlights on our phones to see around. We got a little freaked out but carried on. We walked until the yellow car stopped at its usual place. We stopped roughly 30 feet away from the vehicle. For a second with our flashlights on, we heard the door open and footsteps approaching us. We gasped and shut off our phones. We bolted away. We were faster than whoever that was, but we knew they were running after us. I asked Ryan in a whisper if he had brought any pepper spray, and of course he wouldn't bring it the one time we would need it. We hid behind big gravestones for a couple of minutes waiting to see if they would run past, but they never did. They must have given up. We waited another couple of minutes, bolted out of the cemetery entirely out of breath, and never looked back. We joked about it a little since before we went into the graveyard we said, imagine if something terrifying would happen, and speak of the devil. What would have happened to us if they had caught us? What would they have done to us? I don't know. I'm just glad that we took extreme caution when we saw that car. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be here to write this. Living Across from a Cemetery by Pam M. Hey Swamp Dweller, my name is Pam and I'm from North Mississippi. I have a paranormal story to share for you. It's not the most scary, but it's actually kinda creepy. Sometimes though, when I think back on it, it gives me a good laugh. Anyway, I used to live beside an old cemetery when I was a child. Some of these graves were from the 1800s and they were pretty cool. My house was across the street from the cemetery and my family and I experienced many events during the 12 years we lived there. We witnessed a large orange gaseous ball roll out of the cemetery gates and down the street before dissipating. We did learn that many people would see these strange gases rising from the cemetery. It was scary and weird. Also, when returning from dates, my sister would frequently see a man standing beside our house. But when my father would go out and check, there would never be anyone there, and there was never any sort of footsteps or any sign that somebody had been standing or walking around the house at all. There were also many nights that the garage door would shake and rattle to the point that it seemed whoever was trying to get into the house would rip the door off the hinges. Again, my dad would go outside and never see a thing. He'd even try slipping around the back of the house in complete darkness, being super quiet to try to sneak up on anybody who may be there. But when my dad would enter the garage, it would go entirely quiet, and there was never a single soul around. Every night my mom would lay my clothes out for school, but occasionally I'd have one shoe missing. Everything would be precise as my mother left it the night before, except for that one shoe. We would always find it in the most strange of places. We knew none of us would put it in those areas because most of the time none of us could even reach it. But let me get to the funny story, I guess. First, I'll have to give you a bit of setup. My mom and dad had some great friends who had kids the same age as my sister and me. All their kids had children around our ages, so my dad fixed us a playroom in the basement with all kinds of fun stuff for us kids to do. So one night, while our parents were in the kitchen playing cards, 4 of us kids were in the basement watching TV, playing on the racetrack or something. This was around 1970, so we didn't have video games, so watching TV or listening to the records was the main activity. It was common knowledge that weird things happened in our house, and we kids were sitting around talking about it. The oldest of the kids was a boy. I'll call him D. D was probably around 15 or 16 years old, and he was the group leader. He was the oldest, and he was the only boy. His sister Mayla, who was 14, was there. My sister, who was 13, and myself, who was 8, were telling some of the strange things that had gone on around the house when we all began to hear knocking outside. It sounded like someone was forcefully knocking on the screen door that went into the basement from outside. We told my dad and he checked it out and you guessed it, nothing. So D, being the big bad boy of our group, plopped down in the chair and stated that he was not scared. He said that he didn't believe in ghosts. He then uttered taunting words as if he was speaking to a spirit. But what he said wasn't very nice. I can't recall his exact words, but I remember his sister saying that he'd better hope there's no ghost after all what he said. He then stated that he still would not be scared if someone flung open the door right now. Well, guess what happened? About 2 seconds after, both the basement door and the door to the house flung open at the same time. Now the screen door pulled out and the wood door pushed in, so there had to be two opposite motions for this to happen, and they were both locked. For them to fly open with such force just didn't make any sense. The force was so great both doors nearly came off the hinges. That screen door bent in a weird way, and it never was normal after that, and the doorknob from the wood door was pushed so hard it left a hole in the sheetrock of the wall. So now, there were 4 of us kids, 3 girls ages 8 to 15 and 1 boy, 16. Big strong D knocked all 3 of us out of his way, running out of that room. He was so terrified that he shoved me, my sister, and his sister into a wall to get by us as we all jumped up and ran to our parents. When I got to my dad, D was in his mother's lap, and D was a big old Mississippi boy. That boy, who wasn't scared of ghosts, crawled into his mother's lap quickly after those doors slammed open. We never really figured out what happened, but D never again said he didn't believe and never again taunted ghosts. I don't know what was wrong with that house. I have to assume living next to a cemetery caused a lot of weird energy to go down. Horrifying Experience in the Bush by T.S. I have had a few paranormal incidents a couple of times in my life. I'm mainly taking photos and seeing figures and orbs, but some still give me goosebumps today. But I will tell you an experience I had while scouting not that long ago. Here's some context. I'm an Eagle Scout and the oldest in my troop with the most experience. Meetings happen for the majority of the school year. During the winter, my troop tends to work on scout skills rather than camping. We were a small troop in a small town, so practicing these skills like orienteering and stuff like that was sometimes challenging. Our troop is within walking distance of a nice wooded area that has a beach filled with trails that everyone knows in the area, and we know them pretty much by heart, and we maintain these trails pretty often. A few months ago, during a meeting, we were going to practice orienteering at night for the newer scouts. This would also help them experience night hiking and to experience situations that may arise while night hiking, either alone or with groups. Now, of course, it's dark out. Everyone has lights on, and we're starting to walk on these sandy, muddy, dark trails. It's a lot easier said than done, to be honest. We get about less than a mile in, and everyone can see and hear the scouts in front of us and behind us fairly well. I'm walking through an area where we all stop to see the tide in the area, and I swear I hear giggles, like a young girl giggling, like a toddler in the brush. I looked around the area, but there was absolutely nothing. I asked the people around me if they had heard it, and they said they had not heard anything. Now, I thought maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me, so we continue going down the trail, and I swear at the next marker it happens again. Now I knew this was off since no one would be on these trails or in the area at all at night, especially this far in. It was super windy and the weather was pretty cold, honestly. People would be at home. When we leave the area and return to the scout room, we are single file line going through the mud, and I swear once again, I hear that voice again. But this time, it was like screaming in my ear, and then giggling once more before stopping for good. I asked the scout behind me, but they didn't hear it. I questioned the scout in front of me, and still, nothing. And that's it. That's my experience. We come back to the scout room and function like normal once again. Thank you for sharing my experience, even though it might be a little anticlimactic. A Local Murder by Skeleton Circus. This was in the mid-2000s when I was about 2nd or 3rd grade. I lived in the rural Midwest and attended a decently sized elementary school. For a few weeks, a friend I had chatted with often was absent from school. I was confused and curious about why he hadn't attended school for so many days. Soon I found out from other kids at the school that he was taking time to rest and recover after a very traumatic experience in his family. I'm not really going to reveal names or anything like that. I do not remember the boy's name anyway, and I don't want to disclose any personal information about those whose names I do remember. For easier reading, I will call the boy who was absent Mike. The standard chats and occasional gossip I'd share with friends on the playground and in the cafeteria took a very dark turn once word got out of why Mike was actually absent. One day a friend of mine, let's call him Chad, told us that Mike's mother was murdered. Hearing later from some of the school employees and even my own parents, I found out that the boyfriend of Mike's sister carried out this horrific act. The killer had snuck into the bedroom of his girlfriend's mother's house. He had then stabbed her to death and slit her throat in her sleep. I don't recall the exact details. I was only 9 or 10 at the time, so hearing this was incredibly shocking. However, something like that happening so close to me, even more so, freaked me out for some reason so deeply. I'm not quite sure how reliable this is, but according to Chad, the mother didn't want her daughter's relationship to go sexual until she and her boyfriend were married. She also didn't like them to get married because apparently the boyfriend was kind of not the best guy and was pretty abusive, but those are just rumors. Now apparently, when the girlfriend's mother told him he no longer had her blessing for marriage, he lost it and formulated a plan to kill her. I was absolutely disgusted and disturbed at such a selfish, pathetic, and creepy motive. This so-called man murdered an innocent woman just because he wanted to have sex with her daughter and was delusional enough to believe that she would go along with him after he carried out such a gruesome act. One day, on the way home from school, my mom pointed out that the funeral procession was happening around our neighborhood. It honestly surprised me that it was so close to where we lived. I remember seeing Mike in his black suit and tie with a very sad look. At school, I remember seeing him and being a pretty easygoing, cheerful guy who enjoyed cracking jokes. But after this, he was dark and seeming like he was very terrified all the time. Horror like this will stay with you. But honestly, I just remembered that life is short and very precious. I don't know if Mike ever returned to school for the rest of that semester. I don't really remember. I do not know what I would have said to him even if he did. What the hell do you say to somebody who just honestly saw somebody that they love have their life ended? What do you say to somebody whose mother had just been taken away by some heartless monster? Dead Pigs in a Ditch by Jeannie I. I live with my family in the rural countryside, about an hour away from any significant cities, about 20 minutes away from any real towns. It is essential to understand how isolated this area is. The cell service around here has issues, to say the least. We have tons of mountains and trees here in Washington. But anyway, there's a place we have always had to go through when going home, and we call it the Hole because the service cuts out for about 6 miles. It wouldn't be so odd if the service hadn't been so excellent before then, like full 5G bars and everything, and then suddenly, nada. There's a curb where a community book nook, I guess if that's what you call it, is. You take a book and leave it, that type thing. It's built like a birdhouse. We stop there from time to time, but not after this. It's in the middle of July. It's hot and arid. We get out and there's a god-awful smell. It smells like carcasses, which isn't rare for out here. Animals die, it's a part of life. But this was terrible, worse than any other time I've been out here. We started to look around when my sister told me to look down in the ditch. This is a steep drop-off. We couldn't have gone down there even if we wanted to. I have a hard time seeing it at first, and then I see multiple shapes I can't quite process. We raise pigs, and their heads are recognizable. They're fat, and their snouts point out. It's a pig head, and it's not just one but multiple. Then when we look closer, we see ribs, pig heads. I understand, but I couldn't at the same time. Now, farmers don't waste meat. The body is decaying, and we can see the flesh rotting off. There are at least 3 to 4 that we can see, and at least 1 deer head, which is also weird because even if you don't collect the deer head, you can certainly sell them for an excellent price. The horns and all that stuff were massive. It was a big buck. This was strange even for the countryside. You don't just throw carcasses into a random place, as it would definitely attract scavengers and probably other predators. And again, you just don't waste meat like this. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it was odd, and it stuck with me my whole life. Now, maybe the animals were sick, but then why the deer head? I don't know. When Living in Isolation Goes Wrong by Anonymous. This had to have happened sometime in the early 2000s. The exact year escapes me. My husband was still spending most of his time on the road working for one of the major insurance companies at the time. As a result of this, myself and our young daughter spent most of our days alone. A few years prior, we had purchased a new home on a somewhat isolated piece of land, and the journey between town and home could often be harrowing, especially at times of heavy rain. It was the middle of nowhere. Most of the last 5 miles of the road that led to the house was nothing more than loose gravel, and wasn't very wide, for that matter. My daughter and I found ourselves stuck on this part of the road on a bad night. I did all I could to keep our old Subaru on the road, but the rain made visibility almost impossible. It wasn't long until I misjudged the one curve and ended up in a ditch. Fortunately, my husband had the foresight to sign us up for one of those roadside assistant programs. I contacted them and was told that the weather was keeping them busy, but they would get to us as soon as possible. Not knowing how long we would be stuck there, I made my daughter as comfortable as I could and waited. The rain stopped soon after, and I was now able to see how far away from home we were. I estimated it was only about 2.5 miles to the house and considered walking, until remembering no one was at home to retrieve the car later. Help was on its way, so I could wait. Within 10 minutes of the accident, I could see headlights of a truck coming toward us and began to get excited. However, it didn't turn out to be a tow truck. Instead, it was an older man driving a rusty pickup. When he saw my car, he slowed down and investigated it. As he passed, I thought he was about to offer to pull us out, but he continued down the road. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but 5 minutes later, the rusty pickup truck approached us coming from the other direction at a very slow speed. He stared at me once again as he passed, even making eye contact with me briefly, but didn't stop. Things were beginning to look odd, but I thought maybe he was lost and turning around to return to the highway. He wasn't obligated to help. Perhaps he thought I was parked instead of stuck. He probably wasn't from around here and just was trying to get home like I was. Things didn't start to get scary until I noticed the same truck coming toward us for a third time. It had quickly gotten completely dark by this point, and most women I know feel much less safe when the sun goes down. This situation did not make things feel any less sketchy. He did his usual, by now, slow drive-by. What was different this time was that he had stopped the truck after he had passed and did a quick 3-point turn in the road. He was now facing us again, stopped about 10 yards away. Rather than get out and come over to offer aid, he sat in the cab and watched for a few minutes. Only now did he open the door and begin to get out of the truck. Almost as soon as he hit the pavement, a pair of headlights appeared in the other direction. The man stayed where he was, watching and waiting for a minute before it was close enough to see it was a wrecker. Once he saw this, he jumped back into his cab and made a U-turn and sped away from us. My heart was stuck in my throat as I watched this play out, and not until I could read the name of the company on the side of the tow truck could I begin to relax. The tow truck driver didn't hesitate to pull his truck in front of us, hook up my car, and I was finally confident that they were there to help. I got out to thank him. He had us out of the ditch in just a few minutes and we were on our way. For the remainder of the journey, I kept my eyes open for the rusty truck, and even as I drove up our drive, I feared I would see him setting in wait. Luckily, he was not, though, and happily I got my daughter out and into the house. When my husband returned from his latest trip, I told him about what had happened during the last storm, but I left out the part with the strange truck. I knew it would only make him more stressed when he was away, and at the time he had no other choice but to continue his trips. Because of this latest trouble, he went out of the way and purchased an almost all-new Jeep with a 4x4 transmission for me.
I was over the moon to get it, and I never got stuck again, even on the muddy parts of our property. It didn't take long for the stranger in the rusty truck to pass from my mind. However, for the next 2 weeks I caught myself looking for it any time I was on that stretch of road. I had almost completely forgotten about the incident, until just recently, when I saw a truck just like it at the store. It, of course, was not the same one, but it caused me to freak out a little bit. It caused all those memories to come flooding back, and motivated me to write this. Fortunately, in the preceding years since then, the county has paved and widened the roads, and my wonderful husband gets to come home to us every single night.
Boone County Blues by Anonymous. If anyone has ever seen the wild and wonderful whites of West Virginia before, this is the exact area where this event occurred. I literally had to drive by their house on the way. Hank Williams III also wrote a song about it called Boone County Blues, which really captures the essence of the depressing, drug-consumed area. I worked as a lab technician for an independent company. I would run an analysis on coal samples to determine the quality. Ash, sulfurs, whatever, things of that nature. Part of the job was driving company pickup trucks to various coal mines, train loadouts, and river docks to draft barges and collect samples. We got a call at around 2 a.m. to go pick up a training sample over in an incredibly remote area in the middle of nowhere. It was a mine, and the mine was miles away from absolutely anything. To get there, I had to drive across a place called Williams Mountain, home of Jesco and all the other whites. It's a notoriously steep, curvy, and dangerous mountain, with a very high rate of accidents. I made it to the mine and collected the sample without incident. After about 15 minutes of driving, I started back up the steep mountain. Having made the trip numerous times, I could take the curves fast, especially when it's pitch dark, and you can see headlights approaching you. The nearest stoplights, stop signs, or street lights are a good 30 miles away, so it's a different kind of dark. The complete darkness just perfectly compounds the isolation. It was because I was driving so fast that I was completely caught by surprise when it appeared that there was a vehicle quickly catching me. I started speeding up, but before I knew it, they had caught up with me. When they got close, they turned on their high beams, and I could tell it was a truck from the height of the lights. But the bright lights had me somewhat blinded. It was then when the terror really began. They started edging closer and closer, until they were right up on my ass. It didn't matter how fast I went, they stayed right up on me. Suddenly, they stopped in the road and killed the headlights, completely weirded out and rattled to my core. I took a huge sigh of relief and started laughing nervously as they dropped from sight. Thinking it was just some idea of a cruel joke, never had I been so ready to see that city skyline. Not too long after, and to my complete and utter horror, the lights started quickly climbing the mountain once again. Frantic, I punched the gas, almost wrecking twice trying to flee. But it was no use. Again the bright lights filled up my mirrors, and simultaneously filled my heart with fear and absolute dread. They would back off a little bit, then get extremely close, repeating this over and over, until they finally rammed me twice. The second time was hard enough to make me swerve, though thankfully, I was able to ride it out. I should note that there is nowhere to pull off while traversing the mountain. Just guardrails on either side, and drop-offs wherever the rails are missing. There is only one little church on a wide spot of the road, so I tried to pull over to let them pass. I put on the signal and turned off, but my pursuers turned off as well and killed their lights. I ducked down but tried to watch for any movement. Nothing. 2 or 3 minutes probably goes by, and I made my move to frantically peel out. To my unimaginable relief, they didn't pull out, but I wasn't convinced it was over. Sure enough, the lights approached once more, though this time it was accompanied by a sound. An unmistakable gut-wrenching sound of gunshots. I'd heard the term hyperventilate, but at that moment I discovered the full force of its meaning. Barely able to breathe, I ducked down as low as I could and started reciting a nonsensical plea for help. This was before cell phones were popular, but to this day, service is non-existent there. The bullets rang out like a soundtrack for my misery, and all I could do was just think at that moment if I would ever see my loved ones again. Time is truly subjective. It felt as though I was on the mountain for days, but I finally reached the end, eventually saw a few houses,
and immediately pulled into the first I could. The truck didn't turn down the driveway, but lingered in the road, with the headlights off. After a couple of minutes, a porch light came on and the truck did a donut and started back up the mountain. A man emerged from the home, but I left as soon as the truck's lights were out of sight. I yelled sorry out of the window and drove like a reckless lunatic the rest of the way. I did end up getting pulled over for speeding on the highway. I didn't even attempt to explain, as I figured it was a small price to pay, all things considered. Obviously, I never entertained the idea of ever making that run again, and my boss started collecting samples in the daytime only for that site. The mountains of West Virginia are incredibly beautiful, but there's also a lot of danger lurking in the depths of their remote location. Places that inspire movies like Wrong Turn. Places where no one can hear you scream.
Close Calls While Hitchhiking by Anonymous.
So I am a 39-year-old female, and many moons ago, sometime between the ages of 15 and 17, when it was still the 90s, me and another girl used to go hitchhiking across the country. When we first went on our little adventure, it never even crossed our minds we might one day need some form of weapon on us for self-defense purposes. So, it was a long time before we got one, and this is a story of 2 instances before that time came, when we would have been in much better positions if we had one. The first one was in Pueblo, Colorado. We were sitting at a gas station contemplating walking up the highway when some random guy told us that he couldn't really take us anywhere, but if we were willing to cook, he'd take us home with him and feed us and let us shower, etc. And while an offer like this may be a red flag for most people, this was well into our time hitchhiking and was a common occurrence, so we agreed. Something we ended up discovering throughout our adventure was that people that didn't converse much were the ones you should probably be worried about the most. This guy didn't really say hardly anything all the way there, and there was deep into the wilderness in the middle of the mountainous somewhere. And if you are familiar with where Pueblo is, you'd know the mountains are pretty far away from there. So we were already getting the creeps, just knowing how far from civilization we were headed. We finally get there, and the guy's giving us both a weird feeling. It's very off and just feels evil. We agree it is not a good idea to stay. So in less than 5 minutes after arriving at this middle-of-nowhere cabin in the woods, we tell him we've changed our minds and want to leave. He seems truly irritated but agrees to take us back after some back and forth. By this time, we of course have obviously no clue where we are or which direction is which, and we are both getting worried. And as we venture out into the woods again, we begin discussing with one another the fact that it feels like it's taking a lot longer to get back than it did to get there. And we both begin to wonder if we are actually going back, or if maybe we're going further into the wilderness. And to make it even worse, we have not spotted even one other vehicle passing us or heading the same direction the entire time. So, now, the conversation is going towards what we might be doing, and if he's leading us further into the woods to our demise. We both agree that there is at least 2 of us and only 1 of him, even if we are both beginning to panic and sweat. So, all we can do is pray and wait it out. And although it still is well over 20 years later, it feels like it was twice as long to return than it did to make it there. And eventually we did make it back to the gas station where we started. He both let us out and we went on our way. The second instant was just outside of Sacramento, California. We had been traveling with a big fat trucker that was also no conversationalist. Even as much as we tried prompting him to talk to us, he had little to nothing to say. We had been traveling in his truck for a few hours and we both had fallen asleep, till I was abruptly awakened by my traveling companion. The truck stopped on the side of the highway and my friend was adamant about us exiting the vehicle immediately. I asked her why and what was wrong, and she told me she had been awakened by the trucker feeling her breast in her sleep. She said his exact words were, "After all I've done for you, you can't let me cop a feel?" So we got out of the truck, literally on the side of the highway somewhere in Sacramento, but we walked away unharmed, and almost completely unviolated. And amazingly enough, out of the nearly 3 years of hitchhiking cross-country together, those were the only 2 real times anything really scary happened to us, and it was the best time of my entire life to this day. Be careful when you're out there. There are a lot of bad people, but definitely don't be scared to live your life and have adventures.